In the dense, unforgiving landscapes of southern Africa, a warrior was born who would change the course of history. Shaka, a man whose name would reverberate through the ages, was the son of Senzingakona, the chief of the Zulu clan. But Shaka's birth was shrouded in an air of tragedy and disdain. The Zulu people, a powerful and ancient group, did not yet understand the full extent of what this child would come to represent. As an infant, Shaka was cast aside as an illegitimate heir, born of an unsanctioned union between Senzangakona and a woman from another clan. In the cruel customs of his time, such children had little hope of claiming their father's power or standing. Yet, Shaka's journey to greatness began in those very hardships. From his early years, Shaka was forced to contend with the cruelty of rejection. He was raised not among the comfort of the royal household, but in the rough, unforgiving conditions of the wilderness. His father, Senzangakona, although the ruler of the Zulu clan, paid little attention to the boy. It was his mother, Nandi, who, with fierce resolve, saw to it that Shaka was nurtured and instilled with the strength to overcome the emotional and physical hardships of his childhood. Nandi's influence was profound. She was a woman of iron will, and she passed that strength on to her son. The fact that Shaka was born illegitimate shaped him in ways that would have profound effects on his future. It was the rejection, the coldness, and the harsh judgment he received from his own people that would fuel his determination. Unlike others in his position, who might have withered under such cruelty, Shaka channeled it into a burning ambition. His resentment toward the world that had cast him aside grew into a desire not just for recognition, but for domination. He would not simply carve out a place for himself. He would forge a new order from the ground up. Shaka's early years were defined by struggle, but it was also during this time that he gained critical skills that would later define his genius. He spent much of his adolescence in the service of neighboring clans and tribes, learning the art of warfare from a young age. The early military training that Shaka underwent was vital for his future success. In particular, it was the training under the tutelage of the fearsome warrior Dingiswayo, who would become a pivotal figure in Shaka's rise to power. Dingiswayo recognized Shaka's natural talent, but more importantly, he saw something else, a mind capable of strategic thinking that far surpassed his peers. Shaka's intellect, paired with his fierce physical prowess, marked him as a formidable force on the battlefield. But the real turning point came when Dingiswayo, recognizing Shaka's potential, offered him a chance to prove his worth. It was in this moment, as he was elevated from a mere warrior to a chief's right-hand man, that Shaka's true character began to take shape. He took the opportunity to study the intricacies of leadership, warfare, and diplomacy. But unlike many others, Shaka did not simply imitate the old ways. He saw that the world was changing and the methods of the past were insufficient to meet the challenges of the present. Under Dingiswayo's mentorship, Shaka began to experiment with new tactics and strategies, many of which were groundbreaking for the time. His use of the buffalo horn formation, where soldiers would surround and then close in on their enemies, was a testament to his innovative approach to battle. But it was not just Shaka's battlefield tactics that set him apart. His insight into the psychological aspects of warfare, his ability to understand the human heart and mind, gave him an advantage over his enemies. Shaka was not simply a warrior. He was a master of war itself. By the time Shaka had grown into a young man, he had already outgrown his early struggles. He was no longer the boy who had been cast aside. He was a man who had proven himself through grit, intelligence, and sheer force of will. However, the path to power was not without its challenges. Shaka's relationship with his father, Senzangakona, was still strained. His father remained indifferent to his accomplishments, refusing to acknowledge his potential. It was in this environment, marked by rejection and resentment, that Shaka decided to take control of his own destiny. The critical moment came when his father died. Senzangakona's passing left a power vacuum, and it was here that Shaka saw his opportunity. Shaka's own legitimacy as the heir to the Zulu throne was tenuous at best, as he had no direct claim to the position by blood alone. But his military genius and the loyalty he commanded from his followers made him a powerful contender. To claim the throne, Shaka did not rely solely on force. He understood the importance of alliances and psychological warfare. He knew that the Zulu people, like many other tribes, valued strength, loyalty, and the respect of the warriors. In the days following his father's death, Shaka rallied his forces, including the elite warriors known as the Impi, who had been trained under his leadership. He also forged alliances with other clans, gaining their support in exchange for promises of protection and resources. But even with these allies, Shaka knew that he would face resistance. Some within the Zulu clan did not believe in Shaka's right to rule, and there were those who sought to take advantage of his youth and inexperience. However, Shaka's strategic brilliance and his ability to inspire his followers gave him the upper hand. He was not just a military leader. He was a symbol of strength and resilience. He was a figure that united disparate groups under a common cause, one that would reshape the very nature of warfare in southern Africa. His rise to power was not just a triumph of military might. It was a testament to the power of ambition, intelligence, and sheer force of will. As Shaka took his place as the ruler of the Zulu people, he began to implement his vision for the future. He began to systematically consolidate power, organizing his warriors into a disciplined and highly effective military machine. The old ways of warfare were abandoned in favor of a more unified and efficient approach. Shaka's Zulu kingdom became a formidable force, one that would not only conquer its neighbors, but would establish a legacy that would echo through history. But it was not just Shaka's military innovations that set him apart. It was his understanding of the larger forces at play in the world. Shaka understood that power was not simply about military might. It was also about control of resources, alliances, and the hearts and minds of the people. He carefully crafted his image, presenting himself as a powerful and just ruler who was dedicated to the welfare of his people. However, behind this image lay a ruthless strategist who would stop at nothing to secure his place at the top. Shaka's rise to power marked the beginning of a new era for southern Africa. His military genius and political savvy allowed him to forge an empire that would rival any in the world. The legacy of Shaka Zulu, the warrior king who defied the odds and changed the course of history, would live on for centuries to come. But even as Shaka stood on the precipice of greatness, the challenges that lay ahead were only beginning to take shape. The world he sought to dominate would not yield easily. His journey was far from over. Shaka Zulu, now firmly entrenched as the leader of the Zulu people, faced a monumental challenge: to transform the disparate clans and factions of his newly acquired kingdom into a unified, powerful force. The path before him was fraught with difficulty, as both external enemies and internal dissent threatened to undermine his vision. Yet, the young king's resolve was unshakable. In the early years of his rule, Shaka set about restructuring the Zulu military and society, laying the groundwork for what would eventually become one of the most formidable empires in southern Africa. The first task on his agenda was to forge a cohesive military force. Shaka understood that the strength of his rule lay in his ability to command and control an army that could not only defend the kingdom, but also expand its borders. To do so, he needed to rethink traditional warfare. The old ways, which relied on disorganized, loosely formed warriors armed with spears and shields, were no longer sufficient. Shaka needed a military that was disciplined, innovative, and capable of executing his strategic vision with precision. The foundation of Shaka's military revolution was the reorganization of the Zulu warriors, or Impi. Traditionally, Zulu warriors have been grouped into age-based regiments, each with varying levels of experience and skill. Shaka broke down these divisions and introduced a new system that emphasized specialization and unity. Every warrior, regardless of age or background, was to undergo intense training designed to maximize their physical strength and combat readiness. The warriors were also equipped with new weapons, most notably the short stabbing spear, or Ikilwa, which replaced a longer thrusting spear used in traditional Zulu warfare. The Ikilwa was shorter and easier to wield in close combat, making it far more effective for the kind of fast, aggressive tactics Shaka envisioned. Shaka's military reforms did not stop at the weaponry. He also revolutionized the way his warriors fought. One of the most iconic changes he introduced was the use of the buffalo horn formation, a strategy that allowed his forces to surround and overwhelm their enemies. The formation consisted of three main sections: the center, which was made up of the strongest warriors; the horns, which consisted of lighter, faster warriors who would flank and encircle the enemy; and the chest, which acted as the main fighting force. This tactical maneuver was designed to overwhelm opponents, forcing them into a vulnerable position and ensuring that they could not escape or regroup. The effectiveness of this strategy was proven time and again on the battlefield, and it soon became the hallmark of Shaka's military genius. But Shaka's military reforms were not merely about tactics and weaponry. They were also about instilling a sense of loyalty, discipline, and unity among his warriors. Under Shaka's leadership, the Impi was transformed from a group of loosely organized fighters into a highly disciplined and professional fighting force. Warriors were trained not only in combat, but also in the values of obedience, loyalty, and collective action. The Zulu army became a well-oiled machine, one that could carry out Shaka's orders with remarkable efficiency and precision. At the same time, Shaka realized that his success would depend on his ability to maintain control over his subjects and allies. While his military reforms were crucial to his rise to power, they were not enough to guarantee long-term stability. Shaka knew that in order to build a lasting empire, he would need to consolidate power within the kingdom and eliminate potential threats from rival clans and chiefs. His reign was marked by a series of brutal campaigns aimed at neutralizing opposition and ensuring his dominance. One of the most striking features of Shaka's rule was his ruthless approach to governance. He tolerated no disloyalty or rebellion, and those who dared to challenge his authority were swiftly dealt with. His enemies, both internal and external, were often subjected to cruel and public punishments meant to serve as a warning to others. Shaka's reign was characterized by a level of fear and intimidation that few rulers in history have been able to match. His subjects, while deeply loyal to him, also lived in constant fear of his wrath. It was this combination of charisma, military genius, and unrelenting cruelty that allowed Shaka to maintain his grip on power. Yet, despite his harsh methods, Shaka was also a pragmatic ruler. He understood the importance of forging alliances and maintaining diplomatic relations with neighboring kingdoms and tribes. His early campaigns were not solely focused on conquest. They were also about building a network of alliances that would strengthen his position. Shaka was a master of negotiation, and he used his military success to bargain for resources, land, and influence. He was not above using marriage as a political tool, marrying the daughters of neighboring chiefs to cement alliances and increase his standing. As Shaka's power grew, so too did his ambitions. He began to look beyond the borders of the Zulu kingdom, setting his sights on the lands of his neighbors. The first of these was the powerful Mthethwa kingdom, which lay to the north of Zulu territory. The Mthethwa had long been a dominant force in the region, and their alliance with Shaka's enemies made them a significant threat. Shaka's strategy was both bold and cunning. Rather than engaging in a direct confrontation, he sought to undermine the Mthethwa chief, Dingiswayo, whom he had once considered an ally. Shaka's tactics were both psychological and military. He sent emissaries to spread rumors and sow discord within the Mthethwa kingdom, creating divisions among the Mthethwa leadership. At the same time, he used his own forces to launch a series of small, swift raids on Mthethwa territory, undermining their defenses and destabilizing their position. The culmination of these efforts was a carefully orchestrated assault on the Mthethwa capital. The Mthethwa forces, unprepared for such a decisive strike, were overwhelmed, and the kingdom fell into disarray. In a move that shocked the region, Shaka absorbed the remnants of the Mthethwa army into his own ranks, adding to the growing power of the Zulu nation. With the Mthethwa conquered, Shaka, turned his attention to other neighboring tribes. His conquests were not just about expanding territory. They were about consolidating his control over the entire region. Shaka's empire expanded rapidly, with each new victory bringing more land, resources, and warriors under his control. The Zulu kingdom became a dominant force in southern Africa, and Shaka's reputation as a military genius spread far and wide. Despite his successes, however, Shaka's rule was not without its challenges. The internal strife that had marked the early years of his reign continued to simmer beneath the surface. There were factions within the Zulu kingdom that resented Shaka's authoritarian style, and his increasingly erratic behavior raised concerns among his closest advisors. As Shaka's power grew, so too did his paranoia. He became increasingly distrustful of those around him, and his cruelty grew even more pronounced. It was in these later years of his reign that Shaka's mental state began to deteriorate. His obsession with maintaining control over his empire led him to become more isolated and more violent. His advisors and generals, once loyal to him, began to fear for their lives. The once great king, who had built an empire through sheer force of will and military genius, found himself increasingly surrounded by enemies, both within and outside his own court. Yet, even as his world began to unravel, Shaka remained a figure of immense power, a reminder of the brutal price of ambition and the dangers of unchecked authority. By the time Shaka's empire reached its zenith, it had become clear that his reign was both a triumph and a tragedy. He had built a kingdom that would endure for generations, but at the cost of his own peace of mind. His rise to power had been marked by violence, cunning, and innovation, but his later years would be overshadowed by paranoia and instability. Shaka's story is a testament to the complexities of leadership, the fine line between greatness and madness, and the brutal reality of power. As Shaka Zulu's empire expanded, so too did the challenges he faced in maintaining control over the vast territory he had conquered. His initial rise had been marked by military brilliance, but now, with his power firmly entrenched, the nature of his rule began to shift. The very qualities that had made Shaka an exceptional military leader, his discipline, ruthlessness, and drive for control, now began to manifest in ways that strained the stability of his kingdom. The unyielding expansion of his influence came with increasing internal divisions, growing resentment among his subjects, and a rising wave of opposition, even within the Zulu royal court. In the early years of his reign, Shaka had been an almost mythic figure, an invincible warrior king whose strategic genius had swept aside all in his path. The Zulu people revered him, and his enemies feared him. But as his empire grew, the very factors that had driven his meteoric rise, the quest for dominance, the desire for total control, and the unrelenting pressure to expand, began to unravel the fabric of his rule. What was once a kingdom united by loyalty to a single, charismatic leader became a realm marked by suspicion, paranoia, and fear. As Shaka's military victories mounted, so did his sense of invincibility. He had conquered multiple neighboring tribes and absorbed them into his ever-growing empire. Yet, the very size of his kingdom began to present logistical and governance challenges that Shaka was ill-prepared to handle. The centralized nature of his rule, with himself at the absolute head, meant that any failure or setback was viewed as a direct threat to his authority. His intense focus on military matters left little room for the day-to-day affairs of governance, and the administration of his empire began to suffer. Shaka's reliance on force as the primary means of maintaining control caused widespread fear and unrest. In his efforts to prevent any disloyalty, he began to demand absolute obedience from his people, punishing even the smallest infractions with brutal force. The culture of fear that Shaka fostered within his kingdom extended far beyond the battlefield. He became increasingly dictatorial, ruling with an iron fist and showing no tolerance for dissent or disobedience. His once loyal generals, who had fought alongside him in the early campaigns, found themselves facing the wrath of a ruler whose trust was harder to earn and easier to lose. His purges of his own ranks became more frequent, and his decision-making grew more erratic. Shaka's intense isolation and paranoia began to cloud his judgment. He became convinced that conspiracies were being plotted against him, even by those closest to him. One of the most significant turning points in Shaka's reign came with his personal relationships. The king's inner circle had always consisted of family members and trusted generals, many of whom had shared in the hard-won victories that had secured his rule. However, as his reign continued, the balance of power began to shift within the royal court. Shaka's relationship with his half-brothers, who had initially served as key supporters of his rise, began to deteriorate. The king's increasingly erratic behavior, combined with his growing cruelty, created a rift among the Zulu elite. His half-brother, Dingaan, in particular, began to see the mounting tension between the desire for power and loyalty to a king who was beginning to seem more like a tyrant than a leader. Dingaan's resentment was fueled by both personal ambition and the growing unrest in the kingdom. As a close relative, he had witnessed firsthand the deepening of Shaka's isolation and the alienation of those who had once been his most trusted allies. Shaka's relentless drive for expansion, combined with his harsh treatment of his subordinates, had fostered a sense of insecurity within the royal court. Dingaan, emboldened by the quiet support of other dissatisfied members of the Zulu leadership, began to question whether the kingdom could be held together under the current regime. With growing dissatisfaction within the ranks, Dingaan found himself at the center of a conspiracy, a plot to end Shaka's reign and take control of the empire. By now, the challenges of managing such a vast empire had become all-consuming for Shaka. His obsession with consolidating power and expanding his dominion had left little room for the intricacies of statecraft. The governance of his kingdom had fallen into disarray. His once loyal generals, now frustrated with their king's increasingly erratic behavior, began to question his leadership. The ever-present fear of his violent outbursts created a climate where even the most seasoned warriors were hesitant to speak out against him. Yet, beneath the surface, whispers of rebellion spread. The seeds of discontent had been sown long before the conspiracy against Shaka took root. The fateful day when Shaka's reign would come to an end came quietly, with no fanfare, but with the cold and calculated precision of a well-executed plan. Dingaan, with the support of several disillusioned generals and loyalists, acted swiftly and decisively. The conspirators struck while Shaka was at his most vulnerable, isolated in his compound, surrounded only by his closest guards. In the early hours of the morning, Shaka was assassinated in a coup that would send shockwaves throughout the Zulu kingdom and beyond. The death of Shaka Zulu marked the end of an era. His reign, which had been built on military conquest, unyielding authority, and the brutal elimination of rivals, was abruptly brought to a close by the very people who had once served him. Yet, despite his violent end, Shaka's legacy endured. The empire he had built, though now under new leadership, would continue to dominate southern Africa for decades. The Zulu kingdom, though fractured by the loss of its king, remained a force to be reckoned with. Shaka's death set in motion a series of events that would ultimately reshape the future of the Zulu people. Dingaan, who had orchestrated the assassination, assumed the throne and sought to consolidate power. However, his reign would be marked by internal strife and further conflict with neighboring tribes, and the cracks in the Zulu empire that Shaka had worked so hard to keep hidden would soon become apparent. Despite the power struggle that followed Shaka's death, there remained a sense of awe and fear surrounding his name. His military innovations, his relentless drive for power, and his ability to inspire loyalty in his followers had left an indelible mark on the Zulu kingdom. Even after his death, Shaka Zulu continued to be remembered as a formidable leader whose legacy would shape the course of African history for generations to come. The mythos surrounding his life and death would become part of the cultural fabric of the Zulu people, and his influence would echo long after the dust had settled. Shaka Zulu's story was one of extraordinary rise and tragic fall, of brilliance and brutality, of ambition and paranoia. It is a tale that speaks to the complexities of power, leadership, and legacy. His empire may have fallen, but the echoes of his reign reverberated far beyond his death. The world that Shaka had helped to shape was forever changed, and the lessons of his reign continue to be studied by historians and military strategists alike. His rise to power was a testament to his military genius, but his fall was a reminder of the dangerous path that unchecked ambition and ruthless leadership can lead. Shaka Zulu's death sent ripples through the very fabric of the Zulu kingdom, shaking the foundation of the empire he had built with blood and steel. The suddenness of his assassination left the people of the Zulu nation in a state of stunned uncertainty. Yet, even in death, Shaka's shadow loomed large over the kingdom he had created. His successor, Dingaan, faced the monumental task of inheriting not only the throne, but also the tremendous weight of Shaka's legacy. The empire Shaka had constructed was formidable, but was also fragile. It had been held together by the iron will of a single man, and now, with that man gone, the future of the Zulu people was anything but certain. Dingaan, who had played a central role in the conspiracy that ended Shaka's reign, now found himself at the helm of a kingdom that was both a triumph and a curse. While he was officially the new king, his rise had not been one of a clear, legitimate succession, and his rule was immediately marred by the violent nature of Shaka's death. He was no longer just a prince or a general. He was now the leader of a people who were still deeply loyal to Shaka's memory. This loyalty was both a blessing and a curse. Dingaan had to balance the need for continuity and stability with the reality of his own, more pragmatic vision for the future. The Zulu kingdom, for all its power, was in a state of flux, and Dingaan's challenge was to hold it together. In the months following Shaka's assassination, Dingaan sought to solidify his position as king. He had no illusions about the precariousness of his rule. The memory of Shaka's reign loomed over him, and many of the Zulu people viewed him with suspicion, knowing that he had been involved in the plotting against their beloved king. Moreover, Dingaan faced opposition not only from within his own court, but also from neighboring tribes and rival factions who saw the power vacuum as an opportunity to challenge Zulu dominance. One of Dingaan's first acts as king was to establish his authority through military campaigns. He sought to assert his power by continuing the policy of expansion that Shaka had begun. But unlike Shaka, who had ruled through brute force and unrelenting conquest, Dingaan was more cautious in his approach. He understood the importance of securing alliances and maintaining stability within the Zulu kingdom before embarking on new military adventures. However, this cautiousness did not go unnoticed. Dingaan's reluctance to fully embrace the legacy of Shaka's aggressive expansionism made him appear weak in the eyes of some of his more ardent supporters. Despite his best efforts to consolidate power, Dingaan's rule was quickly marked by conflict. His position was challenged by forces within the Zulu royal family, including Shaka's surviving half-brothers, who harbored their own ambitions for the throne. The Zulu kingdom was deeply divided, and the strain of internal dissent threatened to tear the kingdom apart. At the same time, Dingaan had to contend with a growing pressure from external enemies. Neighboring kingdoms, emboldened by the perceived weakness of the Zulu leadership, began to challenge Zulu authority along the borders. In response to these challenges, Dingaan took several significant steps to secure his rule. One of the most notable of these was his decision to build alliances with other tribes in the region. This was a shift from Shaka's more aggressive approach to governance. While Shaka had ruled through fear and conquest, Dingaan sought to establish a more diplomatic approach, negotiating with neighboring chiefs and forging strategic alliances. He sought to present himself not just as a warrior king, but as a ruler capable of diplomacy and cooperation. However, this shift in approach was not universally welcomed by the Zulu people, who had been raised on a diet of military conquest and territorial expansion. Many of Shaka's former generals and warriors, who had fought under the great king's banner, were disillusioned by Dingaan's more measured tactics. They viewed him as weak and indecisive, and their loyalty to the new king was tempered by their nostalgia for Shaka's aggressive, expansionist policies. For these warriors, Dingane's refusal to launch new conquests was seen as a betrayal of the Zulu spirit of dominance and strength. The rift between Dingane and his military commanders deepened as the political situation became more volatile. Internal dissent reached a boiling point when Dingane's half-brother, Mbamba, led a rebellion against the king. The rebellion was fueled by a combination of personal grievances and political ambitions. Mbamba, like many others, believed that Dingane's leadership was weakening the Zulu kingdom, and he sought to exploit the discontent among the warriors to challenge his brother's rule. The rebellion was brutally suppressed, but the violence that ensued only deepened the divisions within the kingdom. In the aftermath of the conflict, Dingane found himself more isolated than ever before. As Dingane's reign progressed, he became increasingly paranoid and mistrustful of those around him. His attempts to consolidate power through diplomacy and military force only led to further instability. The Zulu kingdom, which had once been a monolithic empire under Shaka's iron-fisted rule, was now splintering into factions, each vying for control. The once feared Zulu military was no longer the unstoppable force it had been under Shaka. Instead, it was divided and disillusioned. The warriors who had once fought with unshakable loyalty to their king now found themselves torn between competing loyalties. It was in this environment of uncertainty and division that the British arrived on the shores of southern Africa, seeking to extend their colonial reach across the region. The British were keenly aware of the power vacuum created by Shaka's death and Dingane's fragile hold on the throne. The British saw an opportunity to establish a foothold in the region by exploiting the instability within the Zulu kingdom. In the years that followed, British influence began to spread throughout southern Africa, and the Zulu kingdom was forced to contend with the growing threat of colonial expansion. Despite his best efforts to maintain control, Dingane's rule was slowly but surely eroded by both internal and external pressures. The kingdom, once a towering military power, was now vulnerable to both rebellion and foreign intervention. Dingane's inability to fully embrace Shaka's legacy of unyielding dominance, combined with the discontent among his own people, left him ill-prepared to defend the Zulu kingdom against the encroaching forces of colonialism. The fall of the Zulu kingdom, which had once seemed unthinkable in the wake of Shaka's rise, now appeared inevitable. Dingane's inability to stabilize his rule, coupled with the growing external pressure from the British, set the stage for a period of turmoil that would ultimately lead to the downfall of the Zulu nation. However, even as Dingane's power waned, the Zulu people remained a formidable force. The legacy of Shaka Zulu, despite its flaws and its tragic end, continued to inspire those who fought to preserve their homeland. The story of the Zulu kingdom and the empire built by Shaka would continue to echo through history, reminding all who came after the price of ambition, the cost of power, and the fragile nature of empire. Though the Zulu kingdom would never again reach the heights it had under Shaka's rule, the echoes of his reign would continue to shape the future of southern Africa. His name would remain synonymous with both brilliance and brutality, and his legacy would inspire generations of leaders and warriors who would struggle to hold onto the empire he had created. Shaka's death may have marked the end of an era, but the story of the Zulu people was far from over. It was a story of resilience, of loss, and of the relentless pursuit of power, even in the face of insurmountable odds. The years following Shaka Zulu's death were marked by turmoil and uncertainty. While Dingane had ascended to the throne, his rule was far from stable. The kingdom that Shaka had once held together with an iron fist was now slowly disintegrating under the pressure of internal divisions and external threats. The Zulu kingdom, once united in purpose and strength, was now fragmented, and Dingane's inability to consolidate power fully began to show cracks that would eventually lead to its downfall. Dingane's early reign had begun with a delicate balancing act. The kingdom's stability was precarious, and though he had inherited Shaka's military legacy, Dingane struggled to live up to the expectations that came with the throne. The people of the Zulu kingdom, especially the warriors who had fought for Shaka, were reluctant to accept his more cautious approach to leadership. The fearsome discipline and the unyielding aggression that Shaka had fostered in his warriors were replaced by a period of hesitation and internal conflict. The absence of Shaka's formidable presence left a void that no one, including Dingaan, could easily fill. As Dingaan sought to establish his authority, the tribal factions that Shaka had once subdued began to resurface. The leaders of these tribes, who had been brought into the Zulu fold through conquest or alliance, saw an opportunity to reclaim their independence now that the central power of Shaka was gone. These rebellious chiefs, many of whom had once been vassals to Shaka's formidable military machine, began to question Dingaan's leadership and to push back against Zulu influence in their regions. The military forces, once so tightly controlled and united under Shaka's rule, now faced the rising challenge of rebellion from within. While Dingaan's rule was mired in internal strife, his relationship with his own family was beginning to deteriorate. His own brothers, once loyal to Shaka's cause, now sought power for themselves. The assassination of Shaka, which had been carried out with Dingaan's support, had left a deep scar in the royal family, one that would never heal. The Zulu royal house, once a symbol of unity and power, was now a battleground for competing ambitions. Dingaan's brothers, especially those who felt they had been slighted by Shaka's reign, began to voice their own claims to the throne, leading to a growing sense of instability at the very heart of the Zulu kingdom. This internal division was compounded by the arrival of external forces, which had already begun to sense the weakening of Zulu power. The growing presence of European colonial powers in southern Africa added another layer of complexity to Dingaan's already tenuous rule. The British, having established a foothold in the Cape Colony, were eager to extend their control northward. They saw the turmoil within the Zulu kingdom as an opportunity to push further into the interior, and their presence was increasingly felt on the borders of Zulu territory. Dingaan, though still king, found himself at the mercy of multiple forces pulling him in different directions. His attempts to manage diplomacy with neighboring tribes were marred by his inability to maintain the same level of dominance and respect that Shaka had commanded. Instead of the grand alliances Shaka had once forged, Dingaan's rule saw frequent border skirmishes, rival factions vying for power within the Zulu court, and a weakening of the kingdom's once proud military. Despite his challenges, Dingaan did manage to secure a few military victories, but they were few and far between. The Zulu warriors, once the most feared fighters in all of southern Africa, now fought with less cohesion and less zeal. Dingaan's more diplomatic approach to governance had alienated many of the veteran warriors who had followed Shaka, and his failure to inspire the same fierce loyalty that his brother had cultivated made him vulnerable. The military reforms Shaka had put in place had made the Zulu kingdom the dominant power in the region. But these reforms were now crumbling under the weight of Dingaan's leadership. As Dingaan grappled with the internal decay of the kingdom, his leadership was challenged by an unexpected force, the Voortrekkers. The Voortrekkers, descendants of Dutch colonists who had left the Cape Colony in search of a new life in the interior, were pressing into Zulu territory. They were intent on carving out their own land and establishing their independence for British rule. The Voortrekkers, though not a massive force, represented a new challenge for the Zulu kingdom. They were not like the tribal factions Dingaan had dealt with in the past. They were European settlers with their own ambitions and resources. The presence of the Voortrekkers created an entirely new set of problems for Dingaan. Though he had previously managed to deal with neighboring tribes through military might or diplomacy, the Voortrekkers were a different breed. They were determined, organized, and had no allegiance to the traditional African kingdoms. The Voortrekker settlement in the interior posed a direct threat to Dingaan's control over his southern borders. Their attempts to establish a republic in the heart of Zulu territory would be a major test for Dingaan, as it forced him to confront a new, unfamiliar type of adversary. The conflict between the Voortrekkers and the Zulu kingdom came to a head in 1838, when the Voortrekker leader Andries Pretorius led an expedition into Zulu territory. The Zulu forces under Dingaan's command faced off against the Voortrekkers in what would become one of the most significant battles in the history of southern Africa, the Battle of Blood River. The Voortrekkers, despite being vastly outnumbered, managed to defeat the Zulu forces in a decisive victory. This loss was catastrophic for Dingane's reign and marked the beginning of the end for the Zulu kingdom as a major military power. The defeat at Blood River not only weakened Dingane's position, but also significantly emboldened the Voortrekkers and their colonial ambitions. They soon began to establish a permanent presence in the area, setting the stage for further European incursions into Zulu territory. In the aftermath of the battle, Dingane's authority was irreparably damaged. The loss shattered the myth of the Zulus' invincibility that Shaka had worked so hard to build. The Voortrekkers, though not large in number, had dealt a blow to Zulu morale that would take years to recover from. But the external threat of the Voortrekkers was not Dingane's only problem. His kingdom, already suffering from internal fractures and divisions, now faced the full wrath of a growing colonial presence. The British, sensing the weakness in Zulu leadership, began to encroach further into Zulu territory. The British had already established a foothold in the Cape Colony and were eager to expand their influence across southern Africa. As Dingane's reign faltered, they began to push harder into the interior, and their increasing presence would soon become a direct threat to the very existence of the Zulu kingdom. Dingane's reign had begun with high hopes, as he sought to maintain the legacy of his brother Shaka, but his inability to manage both internal dissent and external threats ultimately led to the kingdom's slow decline. Though the Zulu people remained a proud and formidable force, they were now fighting on multiple fronts. The Voortrekkers, the British, and internal factions all conspired against Dingane's rule. His failure to adapt to the changing political and military landscape sealed the fate of the Zulu kingdom. The decline that had begun with Shaka's death now seemed inevitable, and the great empire that had once dominated southern Africa was on the brink of collapse. The period of Dingane's reign became a tragic reminder of the fragility of empires, especially when the weight of leadership becomes too much for one man to bear. His inability to unite his people, combined with the overwhelming forces pushing in from all sides, left the Zulu kingdom vulnerable. The passing of Shaka's legacy marked the beginning of a new, uncertain era, one where the kingdom he had built with such bloodshed and determination would struggle to survive. The story of the Zulu kingdom, from its peak under Shaka to its slow decline under Dingane, was a tale of greatness, betrayal, and the cost of empire. As the years passed, and the Zulu kingdom continued to suffer under the weight of internal discord and external pressures, Dingane's grip on power continued to slip. The great empire that had once been a force to be reckoned with was now fragmented and vulnerable. The Zulu warriors, who had once been the most feared in all of southern Africa, were no longer the well-organized, fiercely loyal fighting force they had been under Shaka's reign. With each passing year, Dingane found himself struggling not only against the pressures from the outside world, but also against the growing discontent within his own kingdom. The legacy of Shaka was still a heavy burden, one that Dingane could neither escape nor live up to. The former king's name continued to evoke respect, fear, and admiration, but it also cast a long shadow over the new ruler. While Dingane had successfully managed to defeat rival tribal factions within the Zulu kingdom early in his reign, the years that followed saw increasing dissatisfaction with his leadership. His more diplomatic approach to governance had not gone unnoticed, but it was widely perceived as weakness by the warriors who had once fought for Shaka. His inability to inspire the same loyalty, fear, and respect that Shaka had commanded made him vulnerable to the rising tide of rebellion that began to spread within the kingdom. The fractures within the royal family were particularly pronounced. Dingane's own brothers, some of whom had supported Shaka's rise to power, were now disillusioned with his rule. They saw Dingane's leadership as a deviation from the fierce, expansionist policies that Shaka had enacted, and they believed that the Zulu kingdom had lost its way. Among the most vocal critics of Dingane's rule was his brother, Mpande, who had always been a figure of considerable influence within the Zulu court. Mpande, like many others, saw Dingane's diplomatic style as a betrayal of the very spirit of Zulu warrior culture. It was in the midst of this growing discontent that a new opportunity for rebellion arose. In 1840, Mpande, along with a number of disaffected chiefs and warriors, launched a rebellion against Dingane's rule. The rebellion was not just a political challenge, it was a personal one. Mpande, who had long harbored his own ambitions for the throne, saw this as his moment to claim the leadership of the Zulu people. The rebellion was fueled by a mix of personal resentment, political calculations, and a widespread belief that Dingane's reign had brought the Zulu kingdom to the brink of collapse. The rebellion, known as the Battle of Mangasuthu, would prove to be a decisive moment in the history of the Zulu kingdom. Dingane, though still powerful, found himself caught off guard by the speed and intensity of the uprising. His forces, already weakened by years of internal unrest and the military losses they had suffered in recent years, were ill-prepared to face the combined might of Mpande's faction. The battle was fierce, but ultimately, Dingane's forces were defeated, and Mpande emerged as the victor. Dingane was forced to flee his capital, abandoning his throne and the kingdom he had once ruled with such authority. Dingane's defeat marked the end of his reign and the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the Zulu kingdom. Mpande's rise to power was met with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The Zulu people, exhausted by years of instability and conflict, hoped that his leadership would bring a return to the unity and strength that had been lost under Dingane's rule. However, Mpande's ascension was not without its challenges. The kingdom was deeply divided, and the scars of the past were not easily healed. The Zulu people had suffered greatly during Dingane's reign, and they were not quick to forgive the betrayals and failures that had led to their downfall. Despite these challenges, Mpande proved to be a more effective and pragmatic leader than his brother. He sought to stabilize the kingdom by forging new alliances and restoring the military discipline that had been lost during Dingane's reign. While he was not as charismatic or as aggressive as Shaka had been, Mpande was a shrewd ruler who understood the need to balance the old ways of the Zulu warriors with the demands of a changing political landscape. He recognized that the Zulu kingdom could no longer rely solely on military conquest to maintain its power. Instead, it needed to adapt to the new realities of colonial expansion and the growing influence of European powers in southern Africa. Under Mpande's leadership, the Zulu kingdom experienced a period of relative stability, though it was far from the glory days of Shaka's reign. Mpande was able to re-establish control over the Zulu warriors, restoring the military structure that had been so crucial to Shaka's success. However, this restoration of order came at a cost. Mpande's reign was marked by a level of caution and moderation that did not sit well with the more ambitious elements of the Zulu military. The warriors, who had once been the backbone of the Zulu Empire, were now a more fragmented and less cohesive force. The unity and zeal that had characterized Shaka's army were now distant memories, and Mpande's reign would be defined by the slow decline of the once mighty Zulu military. Despite the restoration of stability, the Zulu kingdom could not escape the growing threat of European colonization. The British, who had long sought to expand their control over southern Africa, continued to encroach on Zulu territory. The Battle of Blood River, which had dealt a devastating blow to Shaka's military power, was a reminder of the dangers posed by European expansion. The Voortrekkers, descendants of Dutch settlers, had already begun to establish their own presence in the region, and the British were eager to secure control over the entire southern part of the continent. The British were not content with merely maintaining a foothold in the Cape Colony. They sought to extend their influence into the interior, and the Zulu kingdom stood as one of the last major obstacles to their expansion. Mpande, though skilled in diplomacy, was not prepared for the full force of the British threat. The Zulu kingdom, weakened by years of internal strife and military losses, was in no position to resist the full might of the British Empire. While Mpande attempted to negotiate with the British and secure his kingdom's independence, the growing pressure from European colonizers was inevitable. The Zulu kingdom, once the most powerful force in southern Africa, was now on the brink of collapse. By the time Mpande's reign came to an end, The Zulu kingdom was a shadow of its former self. The British, having secured control over much of southern Africa, turned their attention to the Zulu kingdom. In the years that followed, the kingdom would face a series of military defeats at the hands of the British, and the once great empire that Shaka had built would be dismantled piece by piece. Pan's legacy, though marked by some stability and pragmatic leadership, would be overshadowed by the unstoppable tide of colonialism that was sweeping across the region. The fall of the Zulu kingdom was a tragic reminder of the fragility of empires. The kingdom that had once been the dominant power in southern Africa, stretching from the Indian Ocean to the interior, was now divided and under the control of foreign powers. The Zulu warriors, once the most fearsome fighters in the world, were now a conquered people, their military might eclipsed by the superior technology and organization of the British forces. The legacy of Shaka Zulu, though still remembered by the Zulu people, had been irreversibly altered by the events that followed his death. The Zulu kingdom, though it survived for a time under Pan's rule, could never again regain the power and unity it had once known. In the end, the story of the Zulu kingdom is one of rise and fall, of triumph and tragedy. The legacy of Shaka Zulu, who had once built an empire from the ashes of tribal conflict, would live on in the collective memory of the Zulu people. Yet, the forces of colonialism, internal dissent, and changing political realities would ultimately ensure that the Zulu kingdom would never again achieve the same level of power or glory it had known in its heyday. The empire that Shaka had forged was destined to crumble, but its story, and the story of the people who lived within it, would echo through the corridors of history. The Zulu kingdom, once the mightiest force in southern Africa, had now entered a new era under the shadow of colonial expansion and internal fragmentation. The decline that had started under Dingane's reign and continued under Pan was becoming increasingly evident as the forces of European colonization pressed ever closer to Zulu territory. The British, who had already established themselves as the dominant colonial power in the Cape Colony, were now focused on extending their reach into the interior. For the Zulu kingdom, this was a grave threat, one that the once proud warriors of Shaka could no longer easily fend off. The Zulu people, though proud of their heritage and fiercely protective of their land, were facing overwhelming odds. The British Empire, with its superior military technology, vast resources, and well-organized colonial infrastructure, represented an existential threat. The Zulu kings, struggling with internal divisions and external pressures, found themselves caught between the ambitions of rival factions within their own kingdom and the encroaching might of European powers. The heart of the Zulu kingdom, though still holding on to its cultural and military traditions, was faltering in the face of this powerful colonial juggernaut. As the British continued to extend their influence over southern Africa, the Zulu leadership began to realize that their kingdom could not survive in its current form. The traditional methods of warfare, the reliance on the impi, the Zulu fighting force, were no longer sufficient to ward off the technologically superior European forces. The military tactics and strategies that had once made the Zulu warriors legendary were now outmatched by the firepower and organization of the British Army. The Zulu kingdom's resilience, which had been built on the fierce pride of its warriors and the genius of Shaka's military reforms, was being slowly eroded by forces that it could not match. Yet, despite these immense challenges, the Zulu people refused to surrender their sovereignty. They continued to resist, and their final stand would come with the rise of a new leader, Cetshwayo, the son of Pan, who sought to restore the Zulu kingdom's former glory and, if possible, drive the British from their land. Cetshwayo, who had grown up in the tumultuous period following Shaka's death and the internal strife that had plagued Dingane and Pan's reigns, was a man shaped by the harsh realities of leadership in a time of imperial conquest. Though not as audacious in his tactics as Shaka had been, Cetshwayo was shrewd, strategic, and deeply committed to the survival of his people. Cetshwayo's ascent to the throne marked a turning point for the Zulu kingdom. The internal dissent that had plagued the kingdom under Dingane and Pan seemed to subside under his rule. He understood the importance of unity, especially in the face of the British threat. While he worked to solidify his power internally, he also recognized that the Zulu kingdom's survival depended on maintaining its strength and military readiness. The impi, while not as formidable as it had been in Shaka's time, was restructured under Cetshwayo's leadership to adapt to the changing nature of warfare. Cetshwayo, unlike his predecessors, focused on modernizing the Zulu military while still preserving its traditional forms. He reinforced the training of his warriors, instilling in them the values of discipline, unity, and loyalty that had once made the Zulu army an unstoppable force. He also sought to forge alliances with neighboring tribes, understanding the united front would be essential in resisting British imperialism. However, despite these efforts, the Zulu kingdom remained vulnerable to the growing power of the British. By the early 1870s, tensions between the Zulu kingdom and the British had reached a boiling point. The British, having already established control over much of southern Africa, began to demand that Cetshwayo cede parts of Zulu territory to them. The Zulu king, unwilling to submit to British demands, refused to compromise on the sovereignty of his kingdom. The British, under the command of Sir Bartle Frere, had made it clear that they would not tolerate any further defiance from the Zulus. A confrontation seemed inevitable. It was only a matter of time before war would break out between the two powers. In 1879, the British made their move. They issued an ultimatum to Cetshwayo, demanding that the Zulu kingdom disband its army, cease its warlike activities, and accept British authority over the territory. Cetshwayo, recognizing that the British would not back down, rejected the ultimatum. The Zulu kingdom, with its warriors ready for battle, stood firm in its resolve. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation, one that would come to define the fate of the Zulu people and their kingdom. The ensuing war, known as the Anglo-Zulu War, began in January 1879. The British, underestimating the resolve and capability of the Zulu army, initially believed that the conflict would be a quick and decisive victory. The British forces, led by Lord Chelmsford, numbered around 15,000 men, including infantry, cavalry, and artillery. They were confident in their technological superiority, particularly in their use of rifles and artillery. The Zulu army, by contrast, numbered approximately 25,000 warriors, but they were armed with traditional weapons, spears, shields, and a deep understanding of the terrain. The first major battle of the war was the Battle of Isandlwana, fought on January 22, 1879. The British, confident in their technological advantage, underestimated the skill, speed, and determination of the Zulu warriors. The battle, fought in the hills of Isandlwana, would become one of the most significant defeats in British colonial history. The Zulu forces, using their traditional tactics and the buffalo horn formation, enveloped and overwhelmed the British forces. In a stunning display of military prowess, the Zulus inflicted a crushing defeat on the British, killing over 1,300 British soldiers while suffering only minor casualties themselves. The victory at Isandlwana was a massive blow to the British, and it sent shockwaves through the colonial establishment. For the Zulu kingdom, it was a moment of pride and hope, a testament to the strength and resilience of the Zulu warriors. But the victory was short-lived. Despite their triumph, the Zulus were unable to capitalize on their success. The British, regrouping after their defeat, brought in reinforcements and launched a counteroffensive. The Zulu kingdom, though strong in spirit, was unable to match the British in terms of resources, technology, and logistics. The war raged on for several months, and though the Zulu forces won several other smaller victories, the tide slowly turned in favor of the British. The Zulu kingdom, despite its valiant resistance, was unable to withstand the full might of the British military. Cetshwayo, though an effective leader, was unable to achieve the unity and strategic advantage needed to defeat the British once and for all. In July 1879, the British captured the Zulu capital of Ulundi, and Cetshwayo was forced to flee. The fall of Ulundi marked the end of the Zulu kingdom as an independent state. Cetshwayo was captured and exiled, and the once proud Zulu Empire was reduced to a shadow of its former self. The British annexed Zulu territory and incorporated it into their growing colonial holdings in southern Africa. The fall of the Zulu kingdom was a tragic moment in African history. The kingdom that had once been a beacon of strength, resilience, and military prowess was now part of the British Empire. The Anglo-Zulu War, though a brief conflict, was a symbol of the relentless advance of colonialism, and the Zulu people were forced to accept the dominance of the European powers. Yet, even in defeat, the legacy of the Zulu kingdom endured. The courage and determination of the Zulu warriors in the face of overwhelming odds became a symbol of resistance against colonial oppression. The memory of Shaka Zulu, those centuries in the past, lived on in the hearts and minds of the Zulu people. The kingdom may have fallen, but the spirit of the Zulu people remained unbroken. In the years that followed, the Zulu people would continue to resist colonial rule, and their culture, despite the imposition of European colonialism, would remain a vital part of Southern Africa's identity. The story of the Zulu kingdom, from its rise under Shaka Zulu to its tragic fall under Cetshwayo, is one of courage, resilience, and resistance in the face of overwhelming adversity. It is a story that speaks to the strength of the human spirit and the enduring legacy of those who fight for their freedom and their land. The Zulu kingdom may have fallen to the British, but the memory of its greatness lives on. The fall of the Zulu kingdom in the Anglo-Zulu War marked a crucial turning point in the history of Southern Africa. After Cetshwayo's defeat and the eventual collapse of Zulu sovereignty, the British Empire consolidated its control over the territory, incorporating the once great kingdom into its growing colonial domain. However, the defeat of the Zulu didn't signify the end of their story. The Zulu people, though subjugated, would not be so easily erased from the annals of history. Their legacy would continue to shape the future of South Africa, particularly as the effects of colonialism rippled through the region in the decades that followed. Under British rule, the Zulu kingdom was no longer an independent state. The British had annexed Zulu territory, officially turning it into the natal colony. Cetshwayo, the last king of the Zulu kingdom, was exiled to the island of St. Helena, an isolated spot in the South Atlantic Ocean where he would live in confinement for several years. Though the Zulu kingdom had lost its political autonomy, its culture, traditions, and identity would endure, albeit in a dramatically different form. The Zulu people's resilience and resistance to colonial oppression would continue, as their collective spirit refused to be extinguished. The British colonial administration was, of course, keen to consolidate power, and to do so, they sought to undermine the remnants of Zulu power. The Zulu military, once so formidable under Shaka, was dismantled, and the kingdom's warriors, who had been the heart of the nation's might, were left in limbo. British officials quickly took measures to suppress the traditional military structures and forcibly dismantle any form of organized resistance. Zulu leadership, particularly the traditional chiefs and elders, was marginalized or co-opted by the British, who installed puppet rulers in the place of former Zulu monarchs. But despite these efforts, the British faced significant challenges. Though the Zulu were no longer a unified kingdom, the collective memory of Shaka's reign and the pride in their heritage endured. The British found that the Zulu people were not entirely subdued. They may have lost their kingdom, but they had not lost their sense of identity or the deep connection to their land. The Zulu people remained a powerful force in southern Africa, even as colonial rule sought to break their unity. While the Zulu kingdom itself was no longer an empire, the ideas and ethos of the Zulu people continued to resonate throughout the region. The tradition of the impi, the warrior society, remained deeply embedded in the culture. This warrior ethos, born from the conquests of Shaka, persisted in a variety of forms and found expression in the ongoing resistance to British rule. Though the Zulu no longer fought as an organized military force, their spirit of defiance remained alive in the hearts of many. Moreover, the cultural and spiritual legacy of the Zulu people would continue to influence generations that came after. Zulu music, dance, and language remained a vibrant part of the cultural landscape in southern Africa. The Zulus' reverence for their ancestors, their focus on kinship, and their sense of community were not easily broken by the colonizers' attempts to impose foreign norms and values. The British may have physically defeated the Zulu kingdom, but they had not succeeded in completely extinguishing its spirit. The Zulu people also found a new way to channel their resistance through political means. In the years following the defeat in the Anglo-Zulu War, the British government worked to consolidate control by making the Zulu kingdom a protectorate and later incorporating it fully into the colony of Natal. This move was intended to further integrate the Zulu people into the British colonial system, but it ignited further unrest. Zulu chiefs and ordinary people, who had once been subjects of a powerful kingdom, found themselves subject to foreign rule. British attempts to govern and assimilate the Zulu people were met with sporadic acts of resistance, some of which became organized political movements. The most notable of these movements was the rise of African nationalist sentiments that grew throughout southern Africa during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In the wake of the British annexation, many of the Zulu people found themselves increasingly alienated by the colonizers' policies. As the Zulu population faced economic hardship, land dispossession, and the erosion of their cultural practices, they began to rally against the system of exploitation that had been thrust upon them. This period would lay the groundwork for future movements that sought to regain autonomy for indigenous Africans and dismantle the colonial systems that had oppressed them. Meanwhile, within the Zulu royal family itself, the conflict over succession and power continued to fester. After Cetshwayo's exile, the Zulu throne was left vacant for many years, and various claimants to the throne emerged. In 1883, the British allowed Cetshwayo to return to Zululand, though he was stripped of any power and forbidden from ruling. His return was not a peaceful one. His presence rekindled rivalries and disputes over who should hold the traditional title of Zulu king. The Zulu were divided, and their internal divisions were exacerbated by the imposition of British authority. Cetshwayo, despite his personal misfortune, never fully abandoned his vision of Zulu unity. Even in exile, he remained a symbol of resistance to colonialism and sought, through various means, to rally the Zulu people. The British, wary of his influence, kept him under close supervision. When Cetshwayo died in 1884, the Zulu kingdom was effectively left without a clear leader, and the British sought to maintain their control by installing a puppet king who would serve their interests. The rise of British colonial power was not only a blow to the Zulu, but to many indigenous peoples across Africa. The imposition of colonial borders, the appropriation of land, and the dismantling of local governance structures severely undermined traditional African societies. The Zulu were not alone in their suffering, but their experience highlighted a larger pattern of resistance to European imperialism across the continent. As the 20th century unfolded, the Zulu people, like many African communities, would continue to resist the effects of colonialism. The cultural legacy of Shaka Zulu remained deeply entrenched in the collective consciousness of the Zulu people, and the lessons of their past would continue to inform their struggle for justice, autonomy, and equality. The British colonial experience did not erase the Zulu spirit, but instead, it galvanized a new generation of leaders and activists who would challenge the status quo. In the early 1900s, with the advent of the Union of South Africa and the deepening grip of apartheid, the Zulu people found themselves once again confronted with the oppressive policies of a foreign power. Yet, the legacy of Shaka Zulu, his ambition, his leadership, and his vision for a united kingdom, remained a source of inspiration for many. The Zulu people would continue to fight for their rights, their land, and their identity, often through political means, but also through the preservation of their culture, language, and traditions. One of the key aspects of Zulu resistance in the 20th century was the rise of African nationalism. This movement sought not only to challenge colonial rule, but to dismantle the structures of racial segregation and inequality that had been entrenched during the colonial period. The Zulu played an important role in the broader South African struggle, particularly through their political and cultural contributions. As the African National Congress, ANC, and other political organizations began to gain momentum, Zulu activists and leaders emerged, working alongside other South African groups to resist the policies of the apartheid regime. The Zulu continued to fight for their heritage, and their resistance eventually culminated in the broader struggle for liberation that would culminate in the end of apartheid in 1994. Though it would take decades for the Zulu people to regain some semblance of political autonomy, the lessons of Shaka Zulu's reign, his leadership, his strength, and his refusal to yield to foreign domination remained central to their identity. In the post-apartheid era, the Zulu people continue to be a key cultural and political force in South Africa. The legacy of the Zulu kingdom, despite its fall, lives on, influencing contemporary South African identity and politics. The Zulu language, culture, and traditions remain a vital part of the nation's heritage, and the memory of Shaka Zulu, who unified disparate tribes into a powerful empire, is celebrated as one of the most iconic figures in African history. The story of the Zulu kingdom, from its rise under Shaka to its fall and eventual recovery, is a testament to the resilience of the African spirit. The Zulu people, having faced the full force of colonial conquest, continue to demonstrate the endurance and strength of their cultural identity. Though their kingdom was lost, their legacy endures, a symbol of pride, resistance, and hope for future generations.